Good evening. CrossCurrents is produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. West Nile Virus arrived in Colorado in 2003, and during that year there were 546 confirmed cases with 9 deaths in Larimer County. Since 2003, the number of cases has ranged from a high of 97 just last year in 2013 to a low of 8 in 2012. Larimer County is one of the hardest hit areas in the state. Nationwide in 2012, 5,674 cases of West Nile virus were confirmed. Many of us have either experienced the symptoms of West Nile or know someone who has. It has changed the way many of us view summer activities, especially when it comes to mosquitoes and their bite, which has changed from an annoyance to a significant health concern. While many residents welcome the worrying sound of mosquito spraying, others are concerned about the use of pesticides and their effects on humans and the environment around us. This evening, we've brought together a panel of citizens and experts to discuss the ways in which we attempt to control this public health issue while trying to balance possible environmental and health effects of the control programs. Tonight we have with us Mike Calhoon, Park Supervisor with the City of Fort Collins, Dr. Adrienne LaBailey, Director of Public Health for Larimer County, Dr. Chet Moore, retired CSU professor and an expert in mosquito research, and Rich Fisher, a citizen who's also a beekeeper and organic farmer. Welcome to you and to our studio and viewing audience. About halfway through, we'll invite our studio audience to ask questions about the panel and the information that's been presented. Shall we get started? We thought we'd start tonight with just an overview of the current policy on the West Nile Virus Control Program, and including in that a discussion of whether or not this program has had a significant impact on the rate of West Nile infections in the county, and why the city, late last year, decided to form a West Nile Virus task force. Would you like to start us off?
Sure, I will, Mary. So the goal of the city's West Nile virus mitigation program is to reduce the threat of West Nile virus in the community, but at the same time trying to limit the adverse environmental and health impacts that those controls could have. We do this through an integrated pest management approach, and this is an approach that's recommended by both the CDC and the EPA whenever you want to control a pest. It uses a lot of common sense tools. We have different tools in our toolbox. We developed a program response guidelines, and when we hit thresholds and triggers, those put actions into place whenever those are hit. So that's the overview, I guess, of the city's program.
Okay, Dr. LaBailey, do you want to add to that from a county point of view?
Sure. I really am representing a public health point of view. The county health department is the public health agency for all the cities in Larimer County as well. I think the city does a fabulous job with its efforts to try to prevent mosquito spraying by its educational programs, by its attempts to reduce sources of mosquito breeding. The vast majority of the money spent by the city of Fort Collins is actually in larviciding and surveillance to look at how infected mosquitoes are. And in some years, there's absolutely no money spent on adult mosquito spraying. And I think 2 years, in 2007 and last summer, there was a citywide spray. My concern about the current policy, which the policy changed slightly last year compared to the committee, which originated actually in 2008. So there were some minor changes in the policy. I think there were some major changes in how it was interpreted and implemented. My biggest concerns about the current policy is that, and which I think kept the city from being able to spray when it would have been most effective, potentially in a smaller area than the city as a whole, is the requirement that you have multiple human cases reported before any spray can be considered. And what we know is that the risk of a West Nile infection really closely parallels the number of infected mosquitoes that carry West Nile in the community. So the best time to try to control those mosquitoes is when they're peaking. The unfortunate part about using human cases is the reports of human cases coming to public health lag about a month behind when that person is infected. So you're way behind the curve if you require that West Nile cases, certain number of West Nile cases be reported in a given week. And that's what we faced this summer, where we knew we had really high levels in a smaller area. We wanted to spray, and because the human cases weren't in yet, we couldn't potentially persuade the city to do that at the most appropriate time. The other thing that was different this year compared to past years is in the past where we've seen really high-risk neighborhoods, the risk for West Nile is not evenly distributed around the city. The southeast tends to be the worst, or particularly around Fossil Creek Reservoir, and in bad years it tends to start there. And we were hoping to spray certain areas there early on because they had more than exceeded. They were at 2.5 times the threshold for spraying, but the city as a whole had not, and the policy was interpreted that the city of the whole has to exceed a certain threshold before we'll even talk about spraying. So those are two things I'd really like to see changed as we go into 2014.
So then you consider the number of cases that we had last summer as relatively high compared to what you had been seeing?
Yes, the best way to compare year to year is the serious cases, the so-called neuroinvasive cases, the meningitis, the encephalitis, and the paralysis, because virtually all of those people are hospitalized, tested, and diagnosed, whereas people with West Nile fever, we're lucky if 10% of those people ever get reported to us, but we're pretty sure almost all of those neuroinvasive cases. Last summer was the second worst year compared to 2003, that really horrible year that we've seen in Fort Collins and in Larimer County. So it's the worst since then.
And those cases, most of those did occur in that high mosquito population area?
There were some occurring throughout the county, but the time that many of those were infected was when we would have liked to spray, but we were prevented from doing so. Not we, the county manager felt prevented from doing so because of the policy.
Okay. Chet, you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe to backtrack a little and add to what Mike had to say about the scope of the program. And it's certainly not limited to just larvicides and adulticides. There's a substantial amount of public education going on. One of the key parts of the program is to identify as many larval habitats as possible so that those can be either drained, covered, or treated to eliminate the problem. Ideally, we want to do control at that point rather than once the mosquitoes are on the wing and much harder to contact. Another component of the program that I think is really exemplary, I've over my career had a chance to work with a number of state and local health and vector control programs. The layout for the sampling program, the trapping program to monitor the adult mosquitoes and provide the material for virus testing is one of the best that I've seen anywhere. So I think we can be proud that the city has put that together. All of these things, I think, go together to provide all of the information that's needed for a timely response. And as Adrienne mentioned, one of the issues in the past has been whether or not there needs to be human cases. We and a number of other groups have shown now that the case reports lag the actual infections of people by as many as 2 to 4 or 5 weeks. And what that means is by the time you finally make a decision to act, the majority of the epidemic is over, so that we need to be able to take those early indices and use them to be able to have the greatest impact on transmission.
Rich, you want to talk about why you decided to get involved in the West Nile discussion tonight?
Well, my concern at this point with regard to all the good efforts that are being undertaken, and I think that the county and the city have the best interest of the citizens at heart, and I think really trying to make the very best decisions on behalf of the people of Fort Collins and the county. But I would offer that perhaps we haven't gone quite far enough with the integrated pest management activities before we get to the decision to spray. In other words, I think the decision, the bar to spray ought to be quite a bit higher than it is now. And it appears to me that there are other things at risk that are really not accounted for fully or as much as they should be. For example, and by the way, my organic farm is actually in the county, not in the city. But I do keep my bees in the city, in Midtown, at a CSA farm. And that particular farmer is very concerned that operating a organic CSA, that he cannot, in good faith, represent the crops that he grows to people as being organic if the spraying operation occurs. So he's concerned about that. I think another point is that we're really not convinced of the efficacy of the spraying. In other words, the relationship between having sprayed and cases of West Nile virus. What is that relationship, and has it really been established? Adding the burden of additional pollutants, I think, is a fourth point or a third point, and that is so the chemical that is being applied and the inert chemical that goes with it that actually distributes the permethrin have been used for some time. They're ubiquitous in our environment. You can go to your grocery store, as I understand it, and find this substance, and you're admonished to wash it off, and it's out there. We have it. The question is, should we be adding more to the burden in the city? And who should be making the choices as to whether or not they choose to be exposed to this additional burden? Should it be the people who are exposed in the city, or somebody else?
Okay, let's back up and talk a little bit about these pesticides and larvicides that are being used, what they are, how safe are they, where they come from, and I'm really curious to know more about the larvicide side of the program and whether or not it's considered to be the most effective, as you said.
Well, the product that we use in the larvicide program is as close to a biological control as we can get. It's bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, BTI for short, and it's similar to what Dr. Moore was saying, along the lines of we try to beat them while they're still in the water. So if they don't become adults, they don't turn into biting adults, and we don't have the West Nile virus transmission cycle going on. So that's about the best product that we can use, and we use that in over 90% of our program. So that's where we go out and we inspect the sites, and when we dip test the sites and we find the larva, then the contractor technician will then apply the product. It's in a granular form. It's pretty targeted. It does affect insects in the Diptera family, so it will affect other insects, but the location that we're applying it really focuses on mosquito larvae. So that's the big piece that it does get. So but it doesn't affect other animals or insects.
Now, is there a downside to simply reducing the overall mosquito population?
Yes, there's always a downside when you're taking a food source out of the food chain. Mosquitoes are an important part of the environment, and it's never been our intention in our program to eliminate all mosquitoes in Fort Collins. The idea is to mitigate the risk of West Nile. And that's where this whole program came from. Before 2003, we had no mosquito control program in Fort Collins. This is all based on disease mitigation for us. So.
Okay, Dr. Moore, did you want to?
Yeah, just to add to what Mike said, there are several other components of the control program. Another bacterial product called Bacillus sphaericus, very similar to BTI, but these two are used in different sorts of water. BTI doesn't work in highly polluted water, so that the Bacillus sphaericus can work there. Then there's a juvenile hormone product that's can be used. It's not used very much locally, largely because of price. Also, the timing has to be much more precise when it's applied. There was something else I was going to add in there, and it slipped my mind.
Okay. Dr. LaBailey, do you want to add anything about this larvicide?
Not directly about the larvicides. I was just going to remind people that the areas that we are larviciding, the vast amounts of water that we have in Larimer County, are for the most part man-made. They are irrigation reservoirs. They are the irrigation canals that run throughout the city. I'd never lived in a place like Fort Collins before. I was surprised that there were irrigation canals, and that's great when they're running. They aren't a risk, but as soon as they dry out, you've got miles and miles of puddles all through your city. You've got former gravel pits that have been turned into recreational natural areas. And so our cause of having some of the West Nile problems that we have are because of what humans have done to the environment, not what Mother Nature did.
Can you explain for us what it takes to monitor these larvae pools and to what the city goes through in order to determine this?
Well, I can say, luckily, that I don't actually go out there and do this. We have a contractor who has a team that goes out and dip tests the areas. They do the site inspections, and literally what it is they have a dipper on the end of a rod, and they go out and they're seeking mosquito larvae, and they're looking for it, and they're trying to ID it. And when they find the right mosquito larvae, depending on what stage they're in, they use different products. So they it's very labor intensive. When you go down around Fossil Creek Reservoir on the southeast side of town, if you can imagine going in and doing a site inspection in 10-foot tall cattails, and then finding mosquitoes and deciding that you need to apply this product inside those 10-foot tall cattails in the middle of summer when it's 80 degrees, and you're walking around with a backpack sprayer that is throwing the dried product into the cattails. It's a monumental task. I know that our contractor just at Fossil Creek Reservoir spends, I think, on average 4 hours every Monday morning with 6 people, just trying to get that area handled, and it's very difficult to do that.
They look for the larvae and then they spray immediately if they see it?
If they ID it out, they apply immediately, and it's like I said, it's a dried granular product, and depending on which stage of development the mosquito larva is in, they'll use the different products. So they have to be able to ID that also.
And the level of concern about the efficacy and the safety of these products is especially about the safety of them, is pretty low. There's not much concern about that.
The efficacy is pretty high.
Efficacy is high, yes.
The relative toxicity and safety concerns are fairly low.
Okay. Rich,
relatively.
anything you want to add to that?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I am not an entomologist. I am not an
Oh, okay.
epidemiologist. I do happen to be a meteorologist, and I have been in the air pollution field for a number of years. So I certainly can't comment on those kind of things. But the efficacy that I was speaking about was the relationship between spraying operations and contracting West Nile. So that link seems to me, it's not evident to me where that is, if it does exist.
Okay, let's move to the spraying now and talk about the spraying, because that certainly does seem to raise, let's back up. You remembered what you wanted to
If
say?
I could go back
Sure.
to the thought that I missed, Mike brought it back. The point is that there are only 2 species of mosquitoes that are involved to any extent in West Nile transmission in our part of the country. And so all of the surveillance and control activities are focused on those. There are many other nuisance species that certainly causes problems in the evening when we light up the barbecue, that sort of thing. Those are not of concern in this program. And as Mike indicated, the field crew can tell whether the larvae that they're dipping are Culex larvae or some other kind. And so if it's Culex, then they know that it's appropriate to go ahead and treat.
Okay. Spraying,
Fogging.
fogging, excuse me, fogging.
Well, a
Let's
lot
call it-
of folks have
let's fog it.
a tendency to think that whenever we're spraying the larvicide that we're fogging, and that's not it. We're applying a dried product. That's why I always talk about that with larviciding. But spraying is in our toolbox as far as one of our tools that we utilize if the virus starts to amplify in town. And like I referred to earlier, we have a set of program response guidelines. Those are being reviewed by our technical advisory committee again this winter. And council has asked our TAC, as we call it, to bring recommendations for improvements to those guidelines back to council. And we're scheduled to go to council on March 18th, I do believe, to bring some of those recommendations. Spraying is the biggest controversial thing that we do in this program. There's no doubt about it. And it's probably one of the least favorite jobs that I've ever been involved in working for the city of Fort Collins. We've done it in half the years since we started doing e-mitigation for West Nile virus. So it's not our intention to go out and spray, but when we hit those thresholds and we receive the recommendation from Dr. LaBailey, eventually the city manager makes a decision whether we do that or not. We've had many discussions about what those thresholds should be, how they should be interpreted, when decisions should be made, and we're in those discussions still right now. There are some folks, I can tell you, even on our technical advisory committee, who believe we sprayed too late last year, and there's other people who believe we sprayed too early. So,
Or too much.
Or too much, yes.
Well, I read, I did my Google searches, and there was at least one city in Texas that says once they find one mosquito, they start to spray.
That would be probably classified more as a nuisance program.
Well, they were talking specifically about the West Nile
Really?
mosquito,
Yeah,
yes.
well, that, you could technically call that a mitigation program if they detect West Nile, and then that is what triggers it, but that is not where our threshold is.
Talk about our threshold. Explain it.
We have 4 steps in our program response guidelines, and they go from very early on, what activities are we doing off season, those types of things in preparation, into the low activity part of the season, which includes a lot of our public outreach, ramping up, those types of things. And then we get into level 3, and level 3 is where the action really starts getting intense, because that's the level where adulticiding can be considered. We have a calculation that was created mostly in concert with the CDC, called the West Nile Virus Risk Index. And it's a calculation that takes into consideration the infection rate of the mosquitoes that we're trapping, along with the abundance of those mosquitoes. And it gives us a numerical value so that it displays a risk of contracting the virus. So in our program, right now our threshold is 0.75 on that risk index, and it is interpreted currently as being for the whole town. So we do not, in the current form, have it broken down into smaller areas, but that is a portion of the discussions with the Technical Advisory Committee is a zone approach, so that maybe we can maybe get things a little bit earlier and a little bit smaller to control the amplification. But there's several other criteria, once again, abundance, infection rate, multiple human cases or multiple blood donors that have to be in place before the triggers go, and the response can move forward. So and then we have level 4, which is, someplace we never want to get, is what it comes down to. We never want to get to level 4 where we have a risk index that's out of the, off the charts, and we're scrambling around trying to figure out what to do. But we do have a plan for it, as far as responding to it as best as we can.
So how many human cases were reported last summer when the decision was made to spray?
So part of the problem had to do with how the rule was being interpreted, where that you had to be reported in the same week. So you might have 2 people who got sick in the same week, but were reported in different weeks, and those didn't count. So it just there were weird things that happened. There were delays in reporting last year because the hospital went to a new electronic health record system. There were people who were on vacation. It's just weird things like that shouldn't be what drives whether or not spraying is done. And the unfortunate thing is that by the time, under the best case scenario, because when you get the results of these risk indexes, you're looking at what was going on the week before, because you have to trap, and then they analyze and test, and you get the result the next week. Should you hit a threshold, it's still another week before the city can make the decision, get the word out to the public. So your best case scenario is responding to something that was the case 2 weeks ago. When you start adding the human case requirements, then you're moving out so far that by the time the city sprayed this past summer, 85% of the people who were going to become sick had already been infected. And my point is that whether or not you believe there's a significant environmental risk, the risk is the same whether you spray at the right time or whether you spray late. And wouldn't it be better to stop at least some of those human cases if you could?
I think it's your turn, Rich.
There's a term called risk assessment, and the question it seems that could arise here in this sort of discussion is, when we talk about what is at risk and who is at risk, is a number of different perspectives. One perspective is, so is this, and I'm not sure of the dollars, there's X dollars, I'm sure we'll get to that point. X dollars are invested in this program. The question is, are those X dollars best spent in this program to save lives? And as I understand the program, actually the program says they're killing mosquitoes, but I think they really mean they're trying to prevent West Nile virus. Mm-hmm. Doesn't say that in the program guidelines, but I believe that's what they're trying to do. The question is, from a risk assessment point of view, is that the best use of your dollars? Okay, are you going to get the most bang for your buck? We have any number of other health and safety issues in the county and in the city. And I'm wondering what kind of analysis might have been done whereby West Nile is ranked against all those other risks, particularly given the pushback from people in the city that we heard about last summer. So we know that there's a sizable portion, a portion, I'm not sure how sizable it is, I'll say a vocal portion of the community that has concerns about spraying in particular. Probably less so about larviciding because of the nature of the kind of substance that's used there. But let's just talk about the aerial application. I think there's a sizable number of people that are concerned about that. Are those concerns being addressed? Whose concerns trumps whose other concerns, right? So if you have a sizable portion, maybe small, who are concerned about being exposed to the aerial application of a pesticide, to what extent should those people be listened to? And so then the risk assessment part comes into play when you talk about all the other risks that face people from a health and safety perspective here in the county. And my question there, again, is have those been all addressed, and where does West Nile fall in that hierarchy?
I think there's a couple of good questions that could be discussed there. One goes back to the issue of when we spray. And it seems like last year, by the time the spraying was actually done, the damage had already been done. So any of the environmental impacts of the spraying were not needed because people had already been infected. And in addition, of course, the cost of spraying. We haven't talked about too much about this cost of the program, but we'll get to that once we've covered some of the other things. But how does West Nile, particularly, we talked a little bit before the program about how the numbers have dramatically decreased since those first couple of years, and part of that is just natural cycle when you have an epidemic. Chet, do you want to address that issue and explain that a little bit more?
Oh, goodness. That's going to be a hard one to come at, I think. Just to go back to Rich's point about risk assessment, there has been a large volume of work done on risk assessment, specifically between West Nile infection risk and risk from adverse impact from pesticides, both on human health and on the environment. There's a rather large group at Montana State University that we've been discussing these issues with for probably 4 or 5 years now. So I think that that information has served to form a lot of the ideas that we have on the committee in terms of risk and those issues.
Dr. LaBailey, can you address the issue of risk management for us?
Well, I was just going to try to put how important is West Nile in some kind of context, and different people will obviously disagree. I don't know whether most people know this or not, but Larimer County is in the top 10 counties of the over 3,000 counties in the United States in terms of neuroinvasive disease from West Nile virus. Last summer, we had the most total cases and the most neuroinvasive cases of any county in the state, and the state of Colorado had the second highest number of West Nile cases in the country after the state of California, which is obviously quite a bit bigger than us. As I mentioned, the number of West Nile fever cases that gets reported is a small percentage of what actually probably occurred. But we know that in the city of Fort Collins, we had 9 neuroinvasive cases, and countywide we had 17 neuroinvasive cases. We also know that for each neuroinvasive case, studies have shown that approximately there are 150 to 250 infections for each of those. And of those infections, 20 to 25% of people become ill. So if you look at the disease burden just this past summer, a good estimate of the number of people infected in the city is 1,300 to 2,200 people becoming infected, and approximately 450 to 550 who became ill. What that means is about 10% of West Nile cases actually got reported to us. Sometimes it is not a very serious disease and you recover completely. Sometimes it's an absolutely devastating disease. One of the patients that contracted the disease this summer is somebody who was a healthy, middle-aged male who had run a marathon in Denver the prior year, who was hospitalized for over 140 days. Much of that was on intensive care, on a respirator, was finally released in December, paralyzed and unable to walk, had been unable to breathe for a while, but was able to get off the respirator, was rehospitalized. I actually had emailed him to see if he might want to come tonight. Just found out he's back in intensive care with additional complications. So it's his hospital bill, his out-of-pocket costs for his hospital bill likely exceed the city of Fort Collins' entire West Nile program expenditures for the summer. It can be extremely bad.
I guess a rather insensitive question would be, would a more aggressive spraying program have prevented him from getting West Nile virus?
It's a good question.
I think it's impossible to know that, but I think some of the people who got neuroinvasive disease and got West Nile fever would not have been infected had there been fewer mosquitoes that were infected. I mean, we know that there's a really good correlation. I mean, we've observed it in Fort Collins, but we also have studies, the big outbreak in Dallas in 2012. There's a really strong correlation between when the mosquito index, risk index is high, and in the next 1 to 2 weeks, because there's a 1 to 2 week incubation period, onset of human neuroinvasive disease. And it's very difficult to prove because you can't say, okay, we're gonna take 2 cities of exactly the same risk. That's virtually impossible. We're gonna spray one city and we're not gonna spray the other city, and we're gonna do an experiment. It's not ethical. You wouldn't get people to be willing to do that. But I think at least it's biologically plausible that if you don't have an infected mosquito bite you, you will not get West Nile. And if there's fewer, you are less likely to get an infection.
What are the environmental conditions that make it conditions right for a bad West Nile year?
That's one of the things that we've been interested in for quite a while, because if we can find a relationship between, say, weather predictors or other environmental clues that occur early on in the season, then that would give us a heads up, let us do things like increasing the amount of larval control, increasing public education. All of those things could be expanded. It turns out that there appears at least to be a relationship between cumulative day degrees, that is the amount of warming early in the season, that leads or predicts the possibility of increased West Nile transmission. This makes sense. The warmer it is and the earlier it gets warm, the earlier mosquitoes are going to be coming out of their hibernation sites, taking blood meals, laying eggs, and so the population will be growing more rapidly earlier. And so that is an issue, but then precipitation is another issue, because if there's no rain or if there's very little irrigation water coming down, there's a lack of habitat for one of the two. I mentioned 2 mosquitoes. One, Culex tarsalis, is primarily found in irrigated agriculture and similar situations. So rainfall and irrigation water create habitat for the larvae of this species. So if you have a year like 2012 where we had a drought, there was almost no tarsalis. The infection levels in tarsalis were very low, and all of the West Nile activity, or almost all, was in Culex pipiens, the other of the 2 species, and it's dependent on an entirely different set of environmental conditions. So potentially things like temperature and precipitation can be used to give us a warning system if we have warm spring temperatures and a lot of rain or heavy snow melt. Those would be indicators that would suggest we might be well prepared to look at increased West Nile activity.
Okay, thank you. Anything you want to add to that?
No,
What has the city seen in terms of weather?
well, I'm a little bit simpler thinking than Dr. Moore, obviously, but I think I need water and I need heat. And if you get those two things together, you have mosquitoes.
So we
So-
have quite the snowpack to deal with this year. Are we going to be in trouble this summer again?
Well, one of the areas that's typical with our mosquito production in town is right along the river, right after the June swell. So we get our runoff and we have our swell, and when it recedes, what's it do? It leaves pools of water, and it's hot. And the hotter it is, the faster those mosquitoes reproduce. So the larval control program gets ramped up really fast. So we do monitor for many reasons the snowpack, but the early heat is work that Dr. Moore has been looking at for the last several years, and it looks like a pretty interesting indicator of an early predictor of mosquito activity, which, since West Nile is endemic, that means if we have a lot of mosquito activity, we're probably going to have a decent amount of West Nile.
Okay, let's go back to the fogging issue. And in particular, I know I see a lot of concern being raised about creatures like bees and other things that might be affected by the fogging. And you brought up the issue of organic farming labels. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? Is there evidence that bees are affected by these pesticides?
Well, I don't think there's any dispute that bees, in fact, many pollinators are adversely affected by by this particular chemical that is fogged. The discussion goes like this: well, the spraying is at night. Bees are generally inactive at night, and therefore, and other pollinators as well, and therefore, we're going to solve the problem by spraying at night, and everything's okay. Well, there's a few complications that go along with that. One is that in a hot summer night, July, August, the hives get very hot. At least the commercial, the domesticated bee hives get hot, and so the bees hang out. They try to cool their hive, and they're outside along the outside of the hive, fanning the hive actually. And so there is an issue if you cover the hive and try to keep the bees cool. At the same time, it's a problem. And when do the bees stop trying to keep the hive cool? Well, when the temperatures get down below 90 degrees or so. Another issue has to do with the duration of the chemical that's sprayed. Let's assume that the bee then does not encounter the chemical in the atmosphere as it's being fogged across the landscape. But the bee will encounter it on a foraged material, a flower or a plant leaf or something like that at a later date. While it may not be toxic to that particular bee at that time, the bee can carry the toxin back to the hive. It bioaccumulates in the hive body, in the areas where the pollen is accumulated and where the honey is accumulated and where the larvae are located. And over a period of time, this accumulated material can become toxic to the bees, not to mention the fact that if you're raising honey, growing honey, building hives for the production of honey, you therefore have some concentration of the pollutant in that honey. Then, of course, you have the issue of feral insects, that is, insects that are not kept domestically. They're in the case of northern Colorado, a lot of these feral bees are in cottonwood trees. And of course, you have all the other insects that are around as well. And so there is a risk to those populations. Finally, it's the fish and aquatic environment. Those species are sensitive to the particular fogged material that's being used. So how do we mitigate against all that? And how do we, when we talk about risk assessment, it is not just the risk assessment between spraying and not spraying for humans. It is the risk assessment I was referring to really has to do with other threats to human health and safety. And then you can take the risk assessment further and talk about risk to the environment and to the ecosystem, of which, of course, we are all a part.
When you're talking about risk assessment to other activities, are you going so far as to talk about automobile accidents and, you know, the risks of just everyday living in a city like Fort Collins?
I won't stretch the point, but I will say that for those organic farmers and beekeepers and others who are, or just a person who's trying to grow, you know, food that isn't out of the grocery store in their backyard, you know, there's a challenge for that person to protect that garden from the pesticide.
Okay.
Can I jump in for just a
You
second, Mary?
may.
And one thing I want to point out is that we do have a lot of different tools in our toolbox, and adulticiding is the last one we pull out. We don't go in, you know, for example, a good example of this is last year in 2013. The first week we were trapping, if I remember correctly, we had 4 different traps that turned up positive. Very unusual for the first week of June. And we didn't, Dr. LaBailey didn't make a recommendation. Nobody on the advisory panel thought, boy, we're in trouble as far as, you know, right now.
These were adult mosquitoes.
These were adult mosquitoes that we captured the first week of June, and they were positive. And we did not pull out the adulticiding in the first week of June. It quieted down after that, and we didn't have an issue until we got towards the latter part of July, first part of August. But we are trying to be sensitive to the fact, and this is part of the tenets of the integrated pest management, is it's an issue of risk management is what it is. And as the risk goes up for whatever your threshold, up to your threshold, that's when you pull out more and more serious tools. And when we get to the point where we adulticide, we feel like that is the appropriate tool at that time.
And how often did the city spray last summer?
We sprayed 2 nights.
2 nights. And is that average, let's say, over the last 10 years?
The different years that we have sprayed, we've had a couple of years where we've done multiple applications, but pretty much most of the years we've done 1 application. And I should clarify whenever I talk about an application for adulticiding. Once again, going back to integrated pest management, and you're focusing on the life cycle of the insect. You have to spray, the first night you spray, you have to wait 3 to 5 days and spray a second time. And that's so that you can try to break the transmission cycle of the virus, because that's our goal. It's not to kill every mosquito, it's to break the transmission cycle to reduce the risk of West Nile virus in the community. So you have to spray on the first night, and then you have to come back and spray on the 3rd to 5th night. And that's because the mosquitoes that have already taken a blood meal and are going to lay eggs, their metabolism is going so fast that they metabolize the toxin, okay? So once they have to lay their eggs in the next couple of days. So once they lay their eggs and go back out feeding or host seeking, blood meal seeking, they're susceptible again, and that's why we have to come back and spray the 3rd to the 5th day.
Okay.
I know that's a lot more about mosquitoes than you ever wanted to know.
No, really, I find it very, very interesting. It is a delicate balance between risk management and the cost to even just a handful of human beings in Larimer County. Do we have any questions from our audience before we start to wrap things up here? Okay, let's talk about what citizens of Fort Collins could do on their own that might eventually lead the county to say we don't need to spray. Rich, got some ideas on that? Why don't you start with you at your end?
Well, this term that we've been throwing around tonight, I think, deserves a little bit more elucidation by everybody here on the panel, and that is integrated pest management. You know, sounds like an obtuse term, but really it amounts to trying to do things from the least intrusive approach to the most intrusive. So yeah, I think everybody would agree here in the panel that the highest and most intrusive is going to be the spraying activity. And then at the low end is going to be probably people's personal behavior. Just trying to educate people about putting a insecticide on their, or some sort of protectant on their skin, or staying indoors, or wearing long clothing. Then you can go to natural predators, and then you can go to trying to reduce. I mean, there's a litany of activities I know Mike is very well versed in. But my original point is that I would hope that we as a city could be more encouraging along the lines of the integrated pest management before we get to that highest tier, before we get to that the sort of the nuclear option, which is spraying. And so I think that's the pushback from everybody in the community. Plus, I'm guessing now, and I'm only one person, that it was an abrupt announcement last year, and that caught a lot of people by surprise, the spraying thing. Certainly those that were farmers and had to go out and protect their crop. So I think elucidating on all those activities that people could take themselves to just better behave would go a long ways towards reducing the occurrence of West Nile.
I think there are a number of things that people can do. Obviously, as Rich mentioned, the personal behavior items run high there. Make sure that your backyard doesn't have low-lying areas, that your sprinkler system overwaters and you have water standing for upwards of a week. You can generate thousands of mosquitoes from a small site like that in your backyard. Similarly, bird baths and ornamental ponds, if they're not kept up, can become mosquito habitats. Unfortunately, I mentioned that the two different species of mosquito, one of those, Culex tarsalis, that I mentioned is more seen out in agricultural areas. This mosquito can fly upwards of 7 miles or more a night, considerably more if it's flying with the wind behind it. That means that the potential habitat, adult generating habitat for this mosquito extends well beyond not only the city's boundaries, but the county's boundaries out into surrounding agricultural areas. How do we begin to create a situation where everyone in that larger buffer is aware of the problem and is motivated to take action to reduce the mosquitoes in their particular property? Or can we establish some sort of county, multi-county, regional vector management program that would help to do the surveillance and assist in education and control in those kinds of areas? It seems to me that really is the only way that will effectively limit West Nile in the area.
Trying to reduce the habitat.
Yeah.
Dr. LaBailey.
Like many complex problems, I don't think that there is one solution that will be perfect for everyone. The closest thing I can think of is a vaccine, which is probably not likely anytime in the near future, more for commercial reasons than for scientific reasons. I think certain behaviors could help a lot in terms of preventing West Nile. Unfortunately, behavior is one of those things, whether we're talking about preventing West Nile or wearing your seatbelt or practicing safe sex, that is very hard to change. People are very hard to change, and the more frequently you have to engage in a behavior to be protected, So in the case of putting on repellents, it's something you might have to do every day or several times a day. The less likely you are to be successful. There is research that suggests that, when you wear insect repellent, yes, it does help prevent West Nile. But even probably the most careful user of repellents is probably going to miss a little area of exposed skin. And I think I have not heard a lot of serious concern about human health impacts of spraying, because I think we're pretty confident that those are close to non-existent. As the EPA quantifies risks of various chemicals, they can put numbers on it, and actually their number for the risk of putting insect repellent on your body on one day is probably 100 times riskier than a spray that occurs for the ultra-low volume mosquito control. I don't think either one is a significant health risk, and I don't want to discourage anybody from wearing repellent. I think the human health risk has been largely overstated. There are some people who don't like repellents for aesthetic reasons, or they're concerned about them. There are people who can't afford to buy them. They're homeless. They may not have money to spend on things like repellents. They may live in housing that has poor screens or no screens at all, not air conditioned. They have to sit outside on their porch to cool off on a hot summer day. Some of those people don't have some of the behavioral options that might be helpful to protect them.
Anything you'd like to add?
Once again, I'll boil it down. Don't get bit. You don't get West Nile.
Don't get bit, you don't get West Nile.
That's as simple as it gets.
I only got bit once last summer, so my odds are with me. Mr. Fisher.
Yeah, just one sort of one question, and I don't mean this poking anybody in their eye, but if the permethrin is not toxic or dangerous to humans, does the city and county still advise people to go indoors, close their windows, and stay inside all evening while the spraying is done? And if that is the admonition, and if it's perfectly healthy, why aren't people allowed to be out on their porch enjoying the permethrin?
I would just say we would encourage people to do that if they're worried about it. I have to tell you that, and I'm actually a pesticide-sensitive person because I lack an enzyme that breaks down certain pesticides. This summer, it was so hot on the nights that we're spraying, and I had no way of knowing what time that truck was going down my street. I had my windows open and my whole house fan on that night because I thought that the risk of not getting sleep that night, my health risk of not sleeping that night, was greater than any risk from the permethrin exposure.
Might also mention that permethrin is the active ingredient in one of the most widely used head lice control applications. So I think that might help us get a picture of the relative toxicity here.
Toxicity of permethrin. Okay, well, I'd like to thank our panel for joining us tonight in this CrossCurrents program. This program will be rebroadcast at various times during the month on Channel 14. Please check your local listings for exact times and dates. Copies of current CrossCurrents programs are available at all 3 branches of the Poudre Library District and at the Loveland City Library. The video is available at the League of Women Voters website, which is www.lw-larimercounty.org. Thank you very much to our studio audience and to our panelists. Good night.